Καλησπέρα σας, κυρίες και κύριοι, αγαπητοί φίλοι, συνάδελφοι και φοιτητές. Είμαι η Bonawesco, Διευθύντρια της Αμερικανικής Σχολής Κλασικών Σπουδών στην Αθήνα και είναι χαρά μου να σας καλωσορίζω απόψε στην διάλεξη Writing a New History of Carthage. Καλωσορίζω επίσης όσους μας παρακολουθείτε διαδικτυακά. Η ομιλήτριά μας απόψε, η Denise Dimitriou, είναι μια εξαιρετική ερευνήτρια και πολύ αγαπητή καθηγήτρια. Είμαστε πολύ τυχεροί που φέτος είναι μαζί μας στην σχολή ως Whitehead Distinguished Scholar. Η καθηγήτρια Denise Dimitriou είναι κάτοχος της έδρας Jerry and Jeannie Ringlas στην αρχαία ιστορία στο Πανεπιστήμιο της Καλιφόρνιας στο Σαν Διέγκο, όπου έχει επίσης διατελήσει διευθύντρια του Κέντρου Ελληνικών Σπουδών. Είναι ευρέσως γνωστή και χαίρει μεγάλης εκτίμησης για την έρευνα της πάνω στις σχέσεις μεταξύ Ελλήνων, Φοινικών, Περσών και άλλων κοινότητων που διαμορφώσαν το πολιτιστικό και πολιτικό τοπίο της Μεσογείου. Απόψε θα μοιραστεί μαζί μας μέρος αυτού του έργου με επικέντρο την αρχαία Carthaginian. Okay. Hello, I am Bona Westcote, Director of the American School, and I welcome you here tonight. It is my pleasure to have you here for the lecture, Writing a New History of Carthage. And we welcome also those of you who are joining us online. Our speaker tonight, Denise Dimitriou, is an outstanding researcher and a much-loved professor. We are so very fortunate to have her with us this year as a Whitehead Distinguished Scholar. Professor Dimitriou is the Jerry and Jeannie Ringlas Professor of Ancient History at the University of California, San Diego, where she has also served as the director of UC San Diego's Center for Hellenic Studies. She is well known and much admired for her work on the interactions among Greeks, Phoenicians, Persians, and other communities that have shaped the Mediterranean's cultural and political landscapes. She is currently writing a new history of ancient Carthage, and she will share some of that work with us tonight in her talk. So please join me in welcoming Denise Dimitriou.
Ευχαριστώ, Bona, αλλά εγώ είμαι η τυχερή που είμαι εδώ. So thank you, Bona, for that wonderful introduction. And as I said, I'm the one who's lucky to be here. And thank you all for coming here today, and thank you to all of you who are joining us remotely. Before I get into Carthage, I would like first to express my gratitude, because the American School of Classical Studies in Athens has been my intellectual base for the last 20 years. And this year, as one of the Whitehead scholars, the school has given me a life that is free from my normal responsibilities and has made my research so much easier than it is normally. So I would like to take a moment and thank the people who have helped create this ideal life. And that includes all the staff in Loring Hall, the librarians in the Blegen, the IT team, the administrative staff, Nikos Giokas, Ashley, Ryan, Maria Yorgopoulou, and the regular members, right, I see you, the regular members and the associate members, right, who have taught me so much about where our field is heading to, right, the future of our field. You are the future of our field. Natalia Vogego of Brogan and Tom Brogan, for you've led an unforgettable, I would say, trip to Crete in the best possible ways. Guy Hedrin, the other Whitehead scholar, Denver, who's been my friend and colleague from the University of California, who has been supporting my work for the last 15 years, or basically throughout my career, and Bona, I'm too short to see you, Bona, but there you are, who initiated us in the mysteries of Samothrace. And it was fantastic. She's such a great leader of this institution that we all love so much. So thank you to all of you. Okay, now Carthage. As the title of my talk suggests, I'm currently working on a new history of Carthage from its foundation in the 9th century BCE to its final destruction in late antiquity during the during the Arab invasions in the 9th century CE. I'm at the very, 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 very early stages of conceptualizing this project. So I look forward to the Q&A because your comments will help shape this book. In the first part of the book, I will present some of the challenges of writing a history of Carthage, and then I will discuss a couple of case studies to illustrate my approach and what I think it can reveal about Carthage. Okay. So Carthage in present-day Tunis was one of the wealthiest and most powerful cities of the ancient Mediterranean, and it's known today, best known, I would say, as the implacable adversary of Rome. Right. It was founded on the North African coast in the late 9th century BCE by the Phoenician city-state of Tyre, and its people spoke Phoenician, a Northwest Semitic language. Carthage was far bigger than Athens, and for many centuries it was actually much more important than Rome. Yet it has received rather narrow attention. It has predominantly been studied in the context of the 3 Punic Wars against Rome that began in 264 BCE and ultimately led to Carthage's ruin a little over a century later in 146 BCE. Exceptions, of course, exist to this general picture I am painting here. But the overall focus on the Punic Wars has meant that most books on the history of Carthage overlook the city's early history, end with the Roman destruction of Carthage, and focus on high politics and war at the expense of social and cultural history. Because Carthage lost all 3 of those Punic Wars to Rome, scholars have assumed that the wars with Rome were the defining characteristic of Carthage's history, and have adopted teleological narratives that view Carthage's history as sort of leading inexorably to its ruin in 146 BCE. But methodologically, from a historian's perspective, this is problematic. And the most recent and award-winning book that came out this year in the US in 2026, and we're only in the 3rd month of 2026, has this tagline on the publisher's website, right, that says, "This book is an attempt to reclaim the story from the Romans. This is the Carthaginian version of the tale, and it shows us how, in so many ways, without Carthage, there would be no Rome." Right? So it places Carthage in the service of understanding Rome, which again doesn't give us the Carthaginian perspective. Despite this somewhat limited scholarly approach, Carthage has loomed large in popular imagination in modern history. Just to give you a few examples, Napoleon Bonaparte, in 1788, composed a note on Hannibal, the Carthaginian general who almost defeated Rome on the Italian peninsula in the Second Punic War. Napoleon may also have modeled some of his speeches after Hannibal's speeches as they are recorded in Livy. And according to a conversation that he had in 1800, but it was only published in 1823, he seems to have idolized Hannibal, seeing similarities between himself and the Carthaginian general. So this is just this is just a partial translation of what I have here in the French. And this is Napoleon in this purplish color, right? Who do you think is the greatest in antiquity? Hannibal. I agree. Yes, Hannibal was the greatest captain in the world. Your piece on him is magnificent. And then this is not so relevant to what I want to say, but as a historian, I like the idea that Napoleon criticizes historians and says that those babbling historians sitting in their studies cast judgment all too easily. Napoleon is not the only one. Earlier in the 18th century, the British discussed Carthage as a commercial empire and a possible model they could adopt vis-a-vis their North American colonies. And you can just see in this passage that Carthage is described as a commercial republic and that it basically enriches its motherland, it enriches itself with its conquests, right? So Britain is casting itself as Carthage. And then just a few years later, in the years before the American Revolution, Britain refashioned itself from Carthage to Tyre, right? And it basically started to see its American colonies as a new Carthage. Like the city of Tyre, right, was like Great Britain, and it benefited basically from the commerce that the American colonies were bringing in. Like it benefited from Carthage, like Tyre benefited from Carthage. And eventually, as relations between the colonies and the British Empire became acrimonious, the Britons saw themselves not as Carthage, not as Tyre, but as a Rome that had to destroy this new Carthage. And in fact, the phrase Carthago delenda est was repeated multiple times during the parliamentary debates in the House of Commons when the British were trying to decide what to do. And after the revolution, the American founding fathers considered Carthage as a model for their new republic because of its commercial success, but they also expressed concerns over the corrupting influence of trade. More recently, in 21st century Tunisia, successive governments have used the diversity of ancient Carthage to promote a new multicultural and Mediterranean Tunisian national identity. And I show you here a series with Hannibal and the Carthage port from 2008. And then there is this thing called the Carthage Land, which is a theme park. And this is called Hannibal's March with the little elephants. And then these are the Punic War bumper boats. Bumper boats. Okay. So Carthage figures prominently not only in political ideology, but also in artistic and humanistic projects. The poster for my talk today features Turner's painting Dido Building Carthage, which was inspired by Virgil's Aeneid. Fun fact, in the first draft of his will, Turner stipulated that he should be buried wrapped in the canvas of this painting, but then thankfully decided to donate it to the National Gallery in London together with its companion piece, The Decline of the Carthaginian Empire, which you see here on the slide as well. In 1862, Gustave Flaubert wrote Salammbô, a historical novel set in Carthage that became enormously popular in its time. And it influenced contemporary fashions and made the Carthaginian style the trend of the day. It inspired artists such as Alphonse Mucha, who in 1896 painted Incantation Salammbô. And it even led to new archaeological excavations in North Africa and specifically in Tunis. And the fascination with Carthaginians continues today. If you did not know already, there is a Netflix movie in the works called Hannibal with Denzel Washington. And the movie has actually caused some controversy that was debated even in the Tunisian parliament over casting a black actor to play a Carthaginian. And scientists seem to be fascinated with the Carthaginians. Just about a year ago, on April 23rd, 2025, the New York Times broke an article, "Who's a Carthaginian? Genetic study revises ancestry of Rome's ancient nemesis," based on a study published in the scientific journal Nature. The story was picked up by many popular magazines and newspapers throughout the world, such as The Economist and Smithsonian Magazine, among others. And who is a Carthaginian? The Times suggests that the Carthaginians were Greeks. No, Carthage may have been a diverse city, but the Carthaginians did not identify themselves as Greeks. But these modern uses of Carthage in politics, art, and science are a legacy of our ancient sources. Flaubert's Salammbô or British and American ideas about the weakness and eventual decline of Phoenician commercial empires suffer from a certain Orientalism of their day. But these kinds of attitudes were also present in ancient sources, and they have continued to find expression in modern scholarship as well. As one colleague put it to me recently, in our classes, right, we watch noble Rome grow until it bumps into bad old baby-killing Carthage, which must be wiped out to guarantee the future success of a superior Western civilization. And this brings me to the challenges that ancient sources pose to writing a history of this city. Most ancient literary sources about Carthage were written by non-Carthaginians, primarily Greek and Roman authors, who are openly hostile to Carthage and its people. These sources stereotype the Carthaginians as perfidious and as barbarous. Punica fides, for instance, a phrase first used by the Roman historian Sallust and then repeated ad infinitum by ancient Roman authors, was used to refer to the treacherous and deceitful nature of the Carthaginians. Just to give you one example, Livy describes Hannibal as a brave soldier before saying, "These admirable qualities of the man were equaled by his monstrous vices. His cruelty was inhuman, his perfidy worse than Punic." He was like an ultra-Carthaginian. "He had no regard for truth and none for sanctity, no fear of the gods, no reverence for an oath, no religious scruple." These are essentially ethnic slurs that were repeated against Carthaginians by Roman authors. And these Roman authors include Ennius, Plautus, Cato, Cicero, Nepos, Horace, Martial, Juvenal, Virgil, Quintilian, and these are playwrights and historians, politicians, rhetoricians, poets, and all of them malign the Carthaginians with these stereotypes. As for the Carthaginians as baby killers, about 30 Greek and Roman writers say that Carthaginians sacrificed their children. Diodorus provides a description of this practice, and he says, "In earlier times, it had been their custom to sacrifice to the god the noblest of their sons, but later, buying children in secret and rearing them, they sent these to the sacrifice. There was in that city a bronze statue of Kronos, which is probably Baal Hamon. Once Carthage is captured by the Romans, and there is a cult of Saturn here, who is equivalent to Baal Hamon. Anyway, this bronze statue of Kronos, extending its hands, palms up and sloping towards the ground, so that the child placed in its arms would roll down and fall into a kind of gaping pit filled with fire. This is considered to be a sort of neutral description of this rite, and it is in some ways. It's definitely not as bad as what we saw in Livy's description of Hannibal, but it has spawned more negative interpretations of this practice, and you can see an example of this in this illustrated story of Alix's adventures in Carthage. So these sources, the literary sources, can tell us a lot about how Romans vilified their enemies, but they don't help us in understanding Carthage and Carthaginians from their own perspective. The archaeological evidence is similarly constrained. The Romans razed the city to the ground in 146 BCE at the end of the Third Punic War, and they bulldozed over buildings and people. The Roman destruction wasn't complete, but it was devastating. And most of the material culture from the city dates to the Roman period, after Carthage was refounded as a Roman colony under the Julians. On top of this, material from the city has been looted and reused since the Middle Ages, leaving behind levels that are disturbed. Early excavators of Carthage interpreted the city as primitive and as lacking urbanism and monumental architecture, which is not true. There were large-scale UNESCO excavations carried out in the 1970s, but not all have been published yet. And even though they shed light on pre-Roman Carthage, the interpretations of the city often remain biased towards Greek and Roman perceived ideals. Some recent work has been carried out to digitize material from Carthage, but these databases focus on the Roman period. So how do we uncover the early topography, archaeology, and history of the city with such a difficult archaeological data set? There is a third body of evidence, and these are epigraphic sources. Inscriptions from Carthage in the Punic language allow us to hear the voices of the Carthaginians themselves, such as inscriptions on tombstones, dedications in sanctuaries, which is what you see here, and state decrees. We also have inscriptions by Carthaginians discovered in Greek and Phoenician city-states and in Egypt, and these too reveal Carthaginian perspectives. And decrees regarding Carthage, published by other states, or honoring Carthaginians, show us how ancient polities treated Carthaginians or forged treaties with the city in maybe a more neutral way than the literary sources. These texts have been published, but they remain largely underused in scholarship. So writing Carthage's history presents many problems. How can we approach Carthage from a new perspective, given the limitations of our ancient sources, given the legacy of Carthage in the popular imagination, and the scholarly approaches that are frequently teleological? My proposal is to situate the history of Carthage within a wider Mediterranean network. Doing so can highlight the city's diversity and its economic, cultural, and political networks that extended as far west. Here is Carthage, right? As far west as Morocco, and as far east as beyond what this map shows us to the Achaemenid Empire in what is modern-day Iran. I also suggest that by including epigraphic evidence alongside the material and literary sources, we can expand our focus beyond the Punic Wars. And we can look at the city's relations with indigenous African populations, Greeks, Etruscans, Italic peoples, Iberians, Sardinians, and Eastern and Western Phoenicians from its foundation to late antiquity. And if you look at this map, it's so centrally located, right? I think we can see that. And if we adopt such an approach, Carthage emerges as a city that is neither destined to become a hegemon nor as Rome's nemesis, but as a diverse city embedded in local, regional, and pan-Mediterranean networks with a long history of its own. In the book, I hope to argue that Carthage not only experienced, but also shaped Mediterranean-wide economic and political trends, including the 6th century BCE move from one-man rule to more democratic forms of government, Mediterranean modes of regulating trade, and the 5th century BCE appearance of regional empires. For the rest of my talk today, I would like to focus on two examples that illustrate my approach and arguments. I will discuss how Carthaginian mobility led to religious practices that helped integrate the city's diverse resident population, and how its commercial operations contributed to the creation of Mediterranean-wide modes of regulating trade in the 6th century BCE. And I begin with the observation that Carthage was a city with a diverse population from its very origins and throughout its history. The literary sources reflect this, and the epigraphic record confirms it. For example, the foundation legend of Carthage contains a kernel of the idea that the city was diverse when it describes Dido and her fellow Tyrians as landing on Cyprus and abducting some Cypriot women with them to North Africa. Different sources also mention that intermarriage was common among the Carthaginian elites. Herodotus tells us that the Hamilcar who led the Carthaginian troops at the Battle of Himera in 480 BCE, that he had a Carthaginian father and a mother who was from Syracuse on Sicily, probably Greek. And Hannibal and Hasdrubal both married Iberian women, according to many Roman authors. Polybius and other authors describe the Carthaginian armies as employing many mercenaries who were Numidians and Libyans, Iberians, Gauls, and Greeks. And Diodorus Siculus implies the presence of Greeks in Carthage when he mentions that in 394 BCE, the Carthaginians decided to adopt officially the worship of Demeter and Kore. It was basically an act of repentance because the Carthaginians had destroyed a temple of Demeter in Syracuse. And when they decided to adopt this cult, they consulted the Greeks living in Carthage on how to celebrate the appropriate rituals in the correct Greek way. So these tidbits of information in the literary sources hint that Carthage's population was diverse and that Carthage was connected locally and regionally. And the adoption of the Demeter and Kore cult also suggests that Carthage's pantheon included non-Carthaginian or non-Phoenician gods. The material culture from the earliest levels of the city, which mostly comes from its cemeteries, demonstrates that Carthage participated not just in local and regional, but also in pan-Mediterranean networks that further changed the city's religious practices. By far, one of the commonest finds across the Carthaginian cemeteries from the 8th to the 3rd century BCE are numerous Egyptian and Egyptianizing scarabs and amulets. And I'm just showing you some of the Egyptianizing scarabs on this slide. These, not these, but in general, they depict predominantly the Egyptian gods Ptah Patek, who is also known as Pataikos, Bes, and Anubis. Right? Anubis is a jackal-headed god who oversaw the embalming process. Bes was a protective deity who became popular throughout the Mediterranean in both Phoenician and Greek contexts. Ptah Patek was another protective god, especially prominent in Carthage. Probably more prominent in Carthage than in Egypt in some ways. These objects suggest that the Carthaginians had adopted some religious practices from the Egyptians. And Phoenicians in general often adopted the divinities of others, as did other people in the ancient Mediterranean. In Greek cities, for example, the Phoenicians worshipped Aphrodite, Poseidon, and Heracles as the equivalents to their gods Astarte, Baal, and Melkart. In Egypt, they worshipped Harpocrates as Harpocrates and Isis, the latter usually as an equivalent to their goddess Astarte. In the case of the Egyptian and Egyptianizing scarabs and amulets that were found in Carthage, the Egyptian gods depicted on them seem to have been worshipped as the Egyptian gods, the Egyptian versions of themselves, and not as translations or equivalents of Phoenician gods. This is like when the Carthaginians showed concern over knowing the correct Greek worship of Demeter and Kore when they adopted those two goddesses as their own. At the same time, a few of the amulets discovered in Carthaginian tombs seem to be bicultural products that have Egyptian origins, but that acquired some local flavor. For example, some of the amulets depict signs of Tanit, one of the most prominent deities in Carthage. In addition, a new form of amulet emerged in Carthage. These were amulet capsules that usually represented Egyptian gods and had strips of gold or silver incised with texts in the Phoenician script and language, rolled up and placed inside the capsule. These type of amulets were also in use in Egypt too, but they contained inscribed papyrus strips. In Carthage, the strips depict Egyptian deities or typically Egyptian scenes, such as the ones that you see here. And these are what these capsules look like. Anything from number 18, 19, 20, and 21 are all from Carthage. And these are the unrolled strips, gold strip in this case, that was inside one of the capsules found in Carthage. And this is just a drawing of what this actually depicts. And what we see is that in Carthage, these Egyptian deities, or typically Egyptian scenes, were not, in fact, used in amulets in Egypt. So what we have, I think, especially also with the inscription of asking basically for protection for the deceased, what we see here, or what these objects imply, is that the Carthaginians appropriated Egyptian religion and religious iconography, adapted it for local consumption in Carthage to suit local practices. So far, we have seen that Carthage was a city with a diverse resident population, with an outlook that faced not inward, but toward the greater Mediterranean. And we have also seen that it adopted foreign divinities. Perhaps the diverse nature of the city and its connection to other areas created a more open and inclusive society. We can see such openness also in the most infamous of Carthaginian cults in honor of the goddess Tanit and the god Baal Hamon, which, I guess, the sanctuary offered an avenue for all residents of the city to participate in local rituals. I called it infamous because this is the sanctuary where child sacrifice was practiced. Scholars have argued that this cult first emerged in the middle of the 8th century BCE as a way for the Phoenician immigrants who had founded Carthage to distinguish themselves from other Phoenicians through the practice of religious rites that were not known in their homelands. Most of the burials in the sanctuary in Carthage and in sanctuaries in Sulcis on Sardinia, Rabat in Malta, and Mozia on Sicily are of infants and children up to 6 to 9 years old, and a few of them have animal bones, especially of lambs and goats. The remains found in these urns suggest that what happened in these sanctuaries involved child sacrifice and not a normal burial of a deceased newborn or infant. Although the reasons for such practices are debated, there seems to be a preponderance of evidence, both in ancient literature and in the forensic remains, that children were indeed ritually killed and buried as part of vows made to divinities. The sanctuary of Tanit and Baal Hamon, where child sacrifice was practiced, was also one that offered access and inclusion to the resident population of Carthage. Citizens, immigrants, freedmen, and enslaved persons, men and women, all seem to use this sanctuary. The epigraphic evidence shows just how diverse the resident population was. Inscriptions recording the dedications that individuals had made to the gods show the use of this sanctuary by Greeks, Egyptians, Libyans, Eastern Phoenicians from Sidon and Tyre, Central Mediterranean Phoenicians from the islands of Pantelleria, Ibiza, Sicily, especially Heraclea, Minoa, and Eryx, and San Pietro on Sardinia. And incidentally, we have also lots of tombstones that also record the presence of immigrants from some of the same places and others. But if we just focus on the sanctuary for a moment, I will just show you some of the inscriptions that record Greeks. They date from the 4th to the 2nd centuries BCE. In the first one that's on the slide on the left, we have Philumene, a Greek name, who erected a stele recording the vow that she made to Tanit and Baal Hamon, with a completely formulaic text in Phoenician that reads, "To Lady Tanit, the face of Baal, and to the Lord Baal Hamon, to whom Philumene made a vow." She also gives us the name of her father. This is a formula that we find on practically every other inscribed dedication in this sanctuary, as you can see from just these two other examples that are on this slide. The iconography of Philomena's stele, which I don't have an image of here, but there was a statue of a child associated with it, were typically Carthaginian, as is every other stele that we have from this sanctuary. A second dedication by another Greek records the name of the dedicant's father, and then the name of the dedication to the god of the gods in the Phoenician script and language, and the word meaning suppliant in Greek. And a third inscription from the same sanctuary records the dedication to Tanit and Baal Hamon in the Phoenician script and language, and then the name of the dedicant, Euclea, in Greek. And Phoenician is written from right to left, and so you can see the inscription is, the Phoenician inscription is here from right to left, and then from left to right, the Greek name. So it's almost like you have to read the inscription together for it to make grammatical sense. So these three dedicants were probably Greek immigrants living in Carthage. Another 34 dedications from this sanctuary suggest that Sidonian freedmen and women had access to this sanctuary and had adopted this cult. Enslaved persons who identify themselves by stating their enslaved status also used this same sanctuary. And whether enslaved or freed persons, free men or free women, citizens or immigrants, the dedicants appear to have participated in this cult in the same way. Their stelae were locally bought and inscribed with a formulaic text that appears on all the other stelae dedicated in this sanctuary. That all residents of Carthage used this sanctuary suggests not only that they had equal access to it, but also that the sanctuary itself may have served as a unifying force among all the residents of Carthage. So Carthage was a diverse city. It was a city that from its very beginning was embedded in trade networks crisscrossing the ancient Mediterranean. Perhaps the mobility implicit in diverse societies made it easy for Carthaginians to adopt foreign gods as their own, and also to open their own religious practices to all those who lived in the city, creating a cohesive civic body. And now I will turn to my second example to show how Carthaginian mobility shaped institutions that transcended ethnic boundaries and connected individuals, and how it may have contributed to the creation of Mediterranean-wide modes of regulating trade in the 6th century BCE. One of the more remarkable finds from Carthaginian cemeteries is a small ivory token in the shape of a boar that's inscribed in the Etruscan script and language. It dates from the 6th century BCE, and it was produced and inscribed in Etruria. The inscription incised on the flat back of the token reads, "I belong to Puinel the Carthaginian." Puinel was most likely the personal name of the individual to whom this token belonged, and he defines himself by referring to his city-state of origin, Carthage. This type of object is known as a hospitality token. It was used to prove the identity of its owner and that he was someone bound in the formal transcultural institution of hospitality or guest friendship with another individual. The token buried with Puinel suggests that this Carthaginian man must have traveled extensively, maybe for trade, and that he was involved in a hospitality relationship with someone in Etruria. Puinel's token is not unique in the Phoenician world of the central Mediterranean. Another 6th century BCE hospitality token inscribed in Etruscan and found in San Tomobono Church in Rome highlights the regional networks connecting Carthage with the central Mediterranean islands and the Italian peninsula. The Etruscan text on this ivory token, this time it's in the shape of a lion, indicates that it belonged to a man called Araz and records his guest friendship with a man named Spurianas, which is an Etruscan name. Araz was from Sulcis, a Phoenician settlement on Sardinia, that was within Carthage's sphere of influence by the 6th, and especially also the 5th century BCE. These tokens were intended to prove who their owners were as they traveled across borders and with whom they had forged an official guest friendship relationship. So they were like passports, but that also stated the nature of the relationship they had with other people. Taken together, these two tokens and their inscriptions demonstrate a network of interethnic connections and show that Carthaginians had formal hospitality ties with Etruscans. The institution of hospitality, as we know, was extremely well established by the 6th century BCE. But objects like these hospitality tokens appear for the first time in this period, in the context of Carthaginian-Etruscan trade relations. The prominence of commercial activities in the central Mediterranean in the Archaic period may have provided the impetus to produce these objects, and so Carthage may have contributed to the appearance of these objects. And eventually, hospitality tokens became common throughout the Mediterranean basin and remained in use until the Roman period. And I give you here some examples from Rome, Iberia, and the last one, this ivory token, records a hospitality agreement between probably Phoenicians, because the names are Phoenician, with a Greek man, or at least a person who has a Greek name. And they are from Lilybeo, so Lilybaeum, which was a Phoenician settlement, a Carthaginian settlement. Carthage's extensive trade contacts and the city's international outlook and connections may also have contributed to the establishment of similar modes of regulating trade across the Mediterranean region. As I hope to have shown, Carthage seems to have been connected to the rest of the Mediterranean from its foundation. We know that Carthaginians were producing and exporting grain, metals, Punic wax, which I learned from Claire Zach, who is one of the associate members here, ceramic vessels, and the Egyptianizing amulets that I mentioned earlier were also exported, especially in this central Mediterranean region. But the other items that I mentioned were exported throughout. Carthaginian ceramics can be found along the same regional network, but Carthaginian grain was transported widely, including to Athens, where in 332 BCE, the Athenians decided to honor a father and son team from Tyre because they had brought grain from Carthage and sold it cheaply to Athens and promised to do so again in the future. Carthaginian traders are also recorded in Boeotia in central Greece in the 4th century BCE, as for example, when in 364 or 63 BCE, the Boeotians honored a certain Nobas, the son of Axiubos, a Carthaginian. And the Boeotians granted him the honorific offices of a proxenos and an euergetes, or the benefactor, as well as the legal awards of inviolability and tax exemptions from custom duties on goods transported, whether traveling by land or by sea. These types of rights both enabled and regulated trade. Carthage was a major commercial hub in the ancient Mediterranean, but the Carthaginians were not the only ones who were sailing and trading in this region. Right? To regulate commercial operations, they formed treaties with other states. Aristotle, in his Politics, for example, alludes to the high volume of cross-cultural trade between Carthage and Etruria and mentions that these states had agreements about imports and about abstaining from dishonesty in their transactions. We don't know anything else about these treaties, but Polybius does preserve an early treaty that Carthage forged with Rome. The ancient historian says that he had personally seen a series of 6 treaties and that the language was archaic and therefore difficult to read. The earliest treaty dates from 509-08 BCE. It was a bilateral agreement between the Romans and their allies and the Carthaginians and their allies. The terms essentially regulated trade in territories controlled by the Romans and the Carthaginians, primarily the Carthaginians in the central Mediterranean. So the first clause here limits where Romans can trade to certain areas and provides provisions in case they accidentally sail beyond the boundaries that are mentioned. It also forbids trade in these areas and stipulates the length of time that these men or these people could stay if they accidentally sail to this region. The second clause administers trade within the accessible areas and ensures that officials oversee any exchanges. And the rest of the text discusses what rights Romans and Carthaginians had if they ended up in each other's territories. Most of the clauses in this treaty, which was reiterated and modified in later years several times, have to do with trade. Scholars have typically discussed the authenticity of this treaty, the veracity of Polybius's account, and what geographic regions are indicated in this text. But if we compare what is stipulated in this treaty with trade regulations from other parts of the Mediterranean from the same period, we find similarities. For instance, Egypt had restrictions in place regarding foreign trade in its territory. In his description of the foundation of the trading post of Naucratis on the Canopic branch of the Nile Delta, Herodotus indicates that Egypt regulated trade in similar ways. First, trade could only take place in Naucratis. Whoever came to any other mouth of the Nile had to swear that he had not come there intentionally, and then had to take his ship and sail to the Canopic mouth. If he could not sail against contrary winds, he had to carry his cargo in barges around the delta until he came to Naucratis. As for Naucratis, the concession of the land to traders was also regulated. The pharaoh Amasis, according to Herodotus, around 570 BCE or so, gave to those Greeks who came to Egypt the city of Naucratis to live in, and to those who traveled to the country just for the purpose of trade without wanting to settle there, he gave them land on which they could set up altars and sanctuaries to their gods. The Carthaginian and Roman treaties were bilateral between autonomous states, while the Egyptian stipulations were unilateral and controlled foreigners trading in the Egyptian state. Still, both the Carthaginian and Egyptian regulations seem to have administered trade in similar ways, suggesting the existence of common regulatory mechanisms in the Mediterranean region, at least in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. For instance, both texts delineate the specific areas in which one could trade and beyond which one could not travel. Both texts include provisions for accidental sailing to prohibited places. Both texts provide regulations for how to conduct trade transactions. Both texts show that the dominant power, Carthage and Egypt in each case, controlled where foreigners, including traders, could settle. And incidentally, the honorary decree awarding several grants to Nobas the Carthaginian from Boeotia also implies that there were trade regulations in Greek cities too. Such trade regulations, as we see here and in the Rome-Carthage Treaty, likely emerged in the 6th century BCE because of the extensive travels and intensive cross-cultural trade among Phoenicians, Etruscans, Greeks, and Carthaginians. So it seems likely that Carthage was one of the contributors to the creation of trade regulations that bore similarities throughout the Mediterranean region. So let me offer some concluding thoughts. First, nothing in the early history of the city suggests that it was destined to become the arch-rival of Rome. Second, mobility introduced new elements in Carthaginian religious practices. Not only did Carthaginians adopt the worship of foreign divinities, Greek and Egyptian ones, as we saw, but they also made their cult to Tanit and Baal Hamon accessible to all residents of the city, enslaved, freed men and women, citizens and immigrants. The diversity of the city and the extensive trade networks of the Carthaginians may have contributed to the establishment of more fluid and inclusive religious practices, and ultimately may have led to the city's growth in wealth and power. Third, Carthage may have helped create Mediterranean-wide institutions. Its central role in trade networks that connected the Mediterranean could have contributed to the appearance of hospitality tokens in this period, in the 6th century. And likewise, since Carthage was a partner in the early trade agreements from the Archaic period, it probably also had a role in shaping what trade regulations looked like across the Mediterranean. In these ways, Carthage emerges not as a city that's destined to greatness or to great ruin, but rather as both typical of wealthy and powerful Mediterranean cities, and at the same time, unique. The fascination of Romans, early, modern, and contemporary artists and intellectuals attests to the enduring legacy of this Mediterranean city. So I hope that my project will contribute to that discussion, and I look forward to our discussion, and thank you for listening. Thank you.
I'll shout out. Denise, thank you so much. That was a really invigorating and reassessing a view of Carthage from its these stories that we've learned and ingrained so much in our ideas about the others that the Carthaginians represent. And I'd like to now open the floor to questions, if that's
Yes.
acceptable to you.
Desired, even, not just
Desired,
acceptable.
okay. Questions in the audience?
Yes, Susan.
And how that worked. Did each party have one that
So-
matched the other, or?
So we don't, wouldn't it be great if we had the equivalent, right, that the other person would own?
What are your thoughts about
Yes,
that?
but that's definitely the presumption. That's what we presume, is that both parties had the token, and presumably both parties would be traveling at some point or another, although that's not necessary. We also have, I didn't say this here, but we also have tokens, hospitality tokens, that record the relationship between an individual and a state. So in those cases, we know that they were probably hung in a public space. And so presumably the individual had a token, and then we have these bronze plaques that were probably just displayed publicly in the state where this relationship existed, I guess. Yeah, so I mean, that's the closest we can come to thinking that there must have been two, that the tokens must have been owned by both parties.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, Margie. The microphone is coming.
Thank you so much for a really interesting talk. I just wondered, in the scope of your project, will you be looking also at Motia in particular? Because there's quite a bit of evidence that seems to me to not be less well preserved on Carthage itself. So generally, my larger question is, will you be including Carthaginian dependencies, or
Yes.
at least places that have been perceived to be dependencies? Because certainly the museum at Motia has a vast array of evidence that I think would be really interesting.
Yes, absolutely. And both in North Africa, or on the North African coast, like Kirkwan, and there's a couple of other cities as well that were or became possibly dependencies of Carthage, or were from their beginning. But also in Sardinia and Sicily, and maybe even some places in Iberia, because those are the places that can give us better archaeological context, especially obviously for the earlier, the pre-Roman Carthage. So yeah, that's definitely part of the project, because I don't think we can, yes, we can say many things, or some things about Carthage just from the material in Carthage, but I think having a comparative approach that includes these other places that seem to have similar across that region, architectural structures or other kinds of practices, I think is absolutely necessary for the success of such a project. Yeah, so thank you.
This is going to be really a great book.
Thank you.
Also, you might want to consider including the Iberian
Yes.
places, because it seems to me that the silver mines in particular were more or less the equivalent of Lavrion for Athens, that the incredible source of metal there was a wellspring for the Carthaginian Empire.
Yeah, thank you. And I was just reading something earlier today that was talking about where they were sourcing silver from, but I didn't pay attention to it. But I do. So I'm sure you're right that it's coming from Iberia, because it would make the most sense. But I would also say that recently there have been these arguments that Iberia wasn't really a dependency of Carthage, or it wasn't part of the Carthaginian Empire, if we want to call it that, in the same way that Sardinia, Sicily, and Malta were. But having said that, the material culture that we see produced in Carthage is also reaching Iberia. So I agree with you that we also have to include Iberia here too. Yeah,
It is a small additional question to the
Yes.
previous question.
Yes.
Would you please correct me if I'm wrong? But it seems to me that in Carthaginian dependencies, there is some material, archaeological material, but settlements as such are very badly preserved. There is no archaeological record to study what it was look like. It seems to me. I'm wrong or
You
not?
mean other settlements by Carthage or in that region around Carthage?
No, in the sense that if you have a Greek apoikia, you have structures, buildings. If you have a Carthaginian settlement, what do we see as traces of their presence there?
Yeah.
In Sicily or in Motia?
Yeah, for example, the example that Margie Miles brought up of Motia is a good one, but also other settlements around Carthage on the North African coast. And the paradox is that we have more from those areas than we do from Carthage. So if we want to look at what Carthage might have looked like, we have to look at the comparison with those sites to infer that, rather than the other way around, which we can do with some of the Greek apoikia. Yeah, right. Thank you. Yeah, Julia?
We have a lot of interest online as well. After Julia.
I want to go to your first case study about the religious practices. You don't have to. You have to change the screen. And the story that you were wanting to tell about this was one of pluralism, one of inclusion. How much of this story is simply a factor of polytheism?
Yeah, thank you. I tried to allude when I was discussing that what the Carthaginians are doing is not dissimilar to what other people in the Mediterranean are doing in this period. And I think it's precisely because of polytheism. I actually debated adding a line about that, but I felt like it made me feel like I was going back to my first book, and so I decided not to. But that's silly. I should have, because of what you just said. I do think that it's the particular structure of religious systems in the Mediterranean that allows for these seeing equivalencies, by seeing equivalencies, then creating new things, new entities, new divinities that end up becoming sort of commonly worshipped by different people in different locations. And so I think the case of Carthage is that I also feel like I should also say, I'm not trying to paint necessarily a rosy picture here of just positive things, inclusion and so on. Obviously, there's also a lot of war happening and other negative things like that. But so I just want to throw that out there. But to your point and to your question, yes, I think that polytheism is the mechanism that allows for what I was talking about to happen. Yeah, Donald.
Well, if I could just, Donald, jump in, right, and then we'll come back to Donald, because there's a question that was related to religion online from Barbet Spaith, who says, why do you think that the cult of Baal Haman in particular was open to foreigners, and why did it appeal to them?
I'm going to presume that the question comes from why would people find the sacrifice of children appealing? But I don't know if I'm presuming that correctly. Babette can correct me. So I think we have to leave our own mindset when we think about this practice. So sometimes when I think about this, I think about Euripides' Medea, where you end up kind of feeling some sympathy for Medea for killing her children. Or I was thinking, I sound like a terrible person now, but I also was thinking more recently about Papadiamandis' Phonissa, where the main character also decides to kill infant girls, but you also feel sorry for her, and I kind of understand where she's coming from when you read this. But anyway, my point is, I think that if we approach this from a contemporary mentality, we are not going to be able to understand it. So I think we have to put ourselves in a different mindset altogether to try and accept that this might have happened. So one other important factor here is that the sanctuary of Tanit and Baal Hamon seems to have been the most prominent and the most important one in Carthage. So it would make sense in some ways that that's the one that's going to work if you want to create a cohesive society where everyone can participate. I also think, the sacrifice of a child is a very expensive thing. It's a very expensive act in all sorts of different ways, and I don't mean financially. So to think about that as a gift to the gods is something that's really, I think can help us understand why it may have happened.
Okay, to turn to Donald.
Yeah, I was intrigued. Thank you for this. I kind of forgot my question, but I think I think it had to do with again, to get back to a little bit to the archaeological evidence. So for the 5th century, there are a number of us who are thinking about these interesting material gaps in the archaeological record, especially in the 6th and 5th centuries in the Mediterranean in general. And so, Carthage comes up in this discussion. And so, in thinking about some of the images that you were showing, what is your thinking about looking for cultural patterns when so much of your evidence is weighted toward mortuary context, which I think some of this is?
Well, but I would say yes, you're right. For the early period, absolutely, it's mostly cemeteries. But also the sanctuary of Tanit and Baal Hamon, which, although you could say is also a funerary context because it involved the burial of or internment of children, I think that we have to see that as a religious context as well. Like, we cannot only see it as a funerary context, we also have to see it as a religious context. So that's helpful because that increases. There are also there have been excavations that have taken place in the early 2000s, though close to the cemeteries or including to some of what is the earliest cemetery in Carthage. Those include some residential quarters, and even latrines. So you do have some contexts that are not just funerary or residential. They're not extensive, but they are there. And the publications from those excavations and other ongoing ones, these are collaborations with Tunisian colleagues and colleagues from mostly European universities, these particular excavations that I'm referring to. Hopefully there will be more of that coming out. But you're right to point out that, definitely what I presented today is just from the sanctuary and the cemeteries, but there is more.
Yeah.
Thank you for a stimulating and interesting talk. In terms of Carthage's participation in pan-Mediterranean systems or broader Mediterranean systems, is there a corpus of bilingual inscriptions? And if so, where have they come from primarily?
Yeah, thank you. So there's some of the bilingual inscriptions that I showed here, which are Greeks in Carthage. We know that there were Carthaginians in Tyre and Sidon, but those are in the same language because they spoke dialects of the same language. In Greece itself, ancient Greek city-states, it's circumstantial evidence that Carthaginians were there. We have evidence that Carthaginians were there, but they are just in Greek because they are produced by a Greek state. Texts that are coming from Carthaginians themselves, both in Athens, for instance, are written in the Phoenician language, but so they are not those are not bilingual. Sorry, I'm just in my head going through what I remember to remember if there's anything. And in Egypt, it's also in Phoenician. So not as many bilinguals as we have of Phoenicians in Greek city-states, for example, or even other places in the Mediterranean where we do have bilingual texts. We don't have as many bilinguals of Carthaginians, but we do have Punic or Phoenician Carthaginian inscriptions outside Carthage.
Thank you.
Well, can I ask what motivated your questions, just so I have in mind what to look for or how to think about this? May I ask what motivated your question, just so I have a sense of how to think about this or how you are thinking about this? Okay. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Kind of in a related follow-up to that, how will you go about trying to separate these ideas that are Turanian in origin versus those things that are Carthaginian in origin? For example, you say Carthage contributed to these regulations, not that they invented them, and I think that's the right language to use. But it also seems like that process had already begun much earlier than the founding of Carthage.
Sorry, what was the last part, Lee?
That process of regulating trade.
Oh, regulating trade.
That we find that in places, Emporia, for example, before the founding of Carthage.
You know, the epigraphic evidence that we have for Naucratis that also shows some regulations comes from the 4th century BCE, and of course Herodotus is writing in the 5th century BCE. So, you know, I don't know exactly what was in place in the 6th century. He attributes these things to the 6th century. Of course, Carthage, you know, that treaty is 509, 508. Okay, these are details. I don't know that I need to distinguish. So I think what motivates me is, if we have been looking at Carthage from this one perspective, or primarily from this one perspective that is more a Roman perspective, then we have been missing the ways in which it was an active participant in pan-Mediterranean-wide institutions. So, and especially it was involved in some of the earliest examples of some of these institutions that we have. So all I can say now, I mean, at this point of the project, but also just with the evidence that I think we have, is tentative in the sense that I can't be sure, but I think I see it as an active participant and contributor. And I don't know that I can fully distinguish, because all of these things that I'm talking about is within a Mediterranean context. Within a Mediterranean context means that it's interacting, Carthage is interacting with other people. So it's not going to be something that one state invents, but rather something that's co-created. And Carthage was one of those co-creators. That makes sense. Thanks, Lee.
I'd like to jump in online with a couple of questions. We have 3 or 4 online, one having to do with numismatics and 2 having to do with ancient DNA.
Okay.
The first is anonymous and says, thank you for this wonderful talk. I was wondering if you have seen the 2023 ancient DNA paper about Kerouane. That shows, 1, a very diverse population at Kerouane with ancestries from many places in the Mediterranean, and 2, some continuity with the local North African preceding population. It approaches ADNA as a way to study Carthaginian North Africa that's not filtered through the lens of Rome. Do you think scientific approaches, when framed this way, can be constructive in writing a new history of Carthage that you're outlining?
So I've seen the 2025 article in Nature that includes forensic evidence from Kerouane, alongside with Carthage, some places in Sardinia, some places in Spain, some places on Sicily, and also other places in North Africa. And it sounds like the results, if this is a different study, I haven't read it, so thank you, first of all. I will read that. But it sounds like the results are pretty similar. So, you know, I highlighted what the New York Times said, that it said that the Carthaginians were Greeks. But what the article in Nature magazine says is not that they were Greeks, but rather that their DNA contains a lot of North African elements, much more than they thought before, and also a strong Aegean element, but also, so not as much Levantine. And they compared this forensic evidence with forensic evidence from the Levant, where 80% of that aDNA indicated local origins. So I think that there are ways in which the scientific evidence can be useful. I also think that it has its limits, and how a person feels or how the Carthaginians felt about themselves, as far as we can tell from their own inscriptions and how they identified, is that they said that they were Carthaginians. Right? There are also some ways in which they come to identify as North Africans. So what DNA is inside them, may not have mattered to them, but it's still an important source to take into consideration. So thank you.
Yeah, and the next question is related. I'll read it just because it provides a little bit broader, but you've answered, I think. This is from Anne Olga Koloski-Ostral, who says that she is a professor emerita from Brandeis University, a Romanist, and specifically a Pompeianist. And in her recent work on non-elites at Pompeii, she too wanted to show the ethnic diversity of first-century Pompeians before the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE. Much new work at Pompeii on skeletal and dental remains reveals DNA that clearly connects Pompeians across the Mediterranean Sea, including North African sites. And then she asked, have you worked with DNA analysis from Carthage, and if so, what have you discovered? This type of research may also support your excellent arguments and approaches to Carthage. So thank you very much.
Yeah. I'm so far only familiar with the 2025 Nature article, but that article also refers to some previous aDNA studies that had been done on a more limited number of individuals who were not from Carthage, but from that central Mediterranean region, from Punic contexts. Actually, I want to say Phoenician context. I don't want to say Punic context. And that also had similar kinds of results as the ones that I've described and as the ones from Pompeii. So, yes, I mean, my short answer to the comment is yes. Well, no, I haven't extensively delved into it, and I need to do more. But yes, I agree that that it has its use as well. Yeah. I feel like, Mantha, did you have a question? Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Denise. My question is, I find great that you're trying to kind of like move away from the literary sources and the vilification or like, the portrayal, modern or, ancient or modern rather, of Carthage. And I guess, when we put this out of the picture, how does Carthage emerge? Is it unique? Is it one city like if we didn't have that portrayal for Rome, would you have a different understanding? How does it compare? And I guess Diachronica as well, how does it compare? I mean, this is a big question at the beginning of the research, but it just like emerged to me when you were presenting. We take out of the picture, the Roman portrayal, and what do we have?
Yeah. So I guess in the first place, I don't want to take it out altogether because I think it still has useful things to say to us. Okay, so one place, I'll say that and then just put that aside. I think the way that I'm thinking about it right now, and I kind of alluded to this in the paper, is that yes, it looks like might be the wrong expression. It is a city that is in the Mediterranean, and if we include these other types of sources, the epigraphic sources, which at least give us their perspective, right, and the archaeological and the material culture, and there is more of that coming out. So I think that there is a lot of space for the material culture to be included, both in the ways that I described in terms of when I answered Margie Miles's question, but also, and Professor Chankowski's, but also from Carthage itself as well. So I think that there is space for us to incorporate this. And so when I said that Carthage looks like a typical wealthy, powerful Mediterranean city, but also unique, what I meant is that, it has its own unique practices, like a Carthaginian or somebody living in Carthage is not going to have the same experiences as somebody who's living in Athens, right? So it's not the same thing. I'm not trying to reduce everything to collapse everything to one model. But I do want to place it in a Mediterranean context, and I think that the material culture that seems to exist both in regional networks but also across the Mediterranean, for instance, suggests that it is so well connected that we should be looking at it from that perspective. And if we do look at it from that perspective, it allows us to not just study the Punic Wars, right? But also, and not just see everything as leading up to that. Like, for example, the Treaty of Carthage and Rome, right? Most of us, like it's in Polybius, it's in the beginning of his description of the relatively early on in the description of the Punic Wars. And people look at it now and look at it in trying to sort of understand it from the perspective of the Punic Wars. What I'm trying to do is, let's say, we can't really throw this away because it's a literary source written in the Roman period. But what I am saying is, why don't we forget about the Punic Wars and look at it from the perspective of this period, time period? And then what emerges, right, is Carthage that's relating to other states in different ways than just in this acrimonious fashion. I don't know if that answers. Okay, thanks.
Any more questions on the floor? We do have one more online.
Yeah.
If there's not more. Okay. This is from Hector Williams, and he says that in their excavations at Symphilos, they found a Carthaginian copper coin, which they assumed was a souvenir. But he wondered to what extent Carthaginian coins have been found across Greece, and if that's a good body of evidence to.
Yes, yes, and he's right, and I don't know the answer to that. I haven't looked at that yet, so that's definitely something I will. I just in everything that I've read in the last 3-4 months, I haven't encountered anything about the circulation of Carthaginian coins. I can speak about Carthaginian coin iconography, but that's not what the question is. So yes, I definitely thank you for that comment. I will, yeah, that's correct. I should look at that.
Well, if there's no more immediate questions, we can go down and enjoy a glass of wine and speak with Denise further. And at this point, I thank her very much for a stimulating talk. Thank you.
Thank you.